Number 1. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker who terrorized Southern California in the mid-1980s, preying on the vulnerable inside their own homes during the absolute dead of night. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez grew up in a deeply troubled household heavily influenced by his older cousin, a decorated Vietnam War veteran and Green Beret named Mike, who would frequently show Richard graphic Polaroid photographs of the horrors he had committed overseas, including the torture, rape, and mutilation of Vietnamese women, an exposure to extreme violence that irreparably warped the young man's psyche and introduced him to the satanic beliefs that would later define his murderous campaign. By his late teens, Ramirez had fully descended into a life of heavy drug use, primarily cocaine and PCP, and petty crime in Texas before migrating to Los Angeles in the early 1980s, a sprawling metropolis that offered him a vast hunting ground of isolated, unsuspecting victims who were completely unaware of the predator moving through the shadows of their neighborhoods. The Night Stalker's official reign of terror began in the early hours of June 28, 1984, when Ramirez crept into a home in Glassell Park and brutally attacked 79-year-old Jenny Vin Cao, binding her, sexually assaulting her, and ultimately slashing her throat so deeply she was nearly decapitated. A horrific crime that initially baffled Los Angeles police detectives who had no physical evidence and no witnesses to connect to a specific suspect. For nearly a year, the killer remained dormant, but on March 17, 1985, Ramirez struck again in Rosemead, attacking 22-year-old Maria Hernandez in her carport, shooting her in the face after the bullet ricocheted off her keys, before entering her apartment and murdering her roommate Dale Okazaki by shooting her point-blank in the forehead as she knelt on the floor in a state of absolute terror. Mere hours after the Rosemead attack, Ramirez drove to Monterey Park and stalked 34-year-old Cillian Veronica Yu, following her into the parking lot of her condominium complex and shooting her in the head with the same handgun, a pattern of escalating violence that sent a shockwave of panic through the Chinese-American communities in the San Gabriel Valley. It quickly became apparent to investigators that the killer was not targeting any specific demographic but rather anyone who was vulnerable, accessible, and caught alone. A realization that was cemented on March 27 when Ramirez attacked Vincent Zazera and his wife Maxine in their Whittier home, shooting Vincent in the head and then proceeding to brutally stab Maxine repeatedly, ultimately gouging out her eyes and carving a grotesque satanic symbol into her thigh with a knife before fleeing the scene. The sheer savagery of the Zazera crime scene, coupled with the apparent ritualistic elements left behind, led detectives to finally connect the string of seemingly random homicides and assign a specialized task force to hunt the perpetrator. But the killer remained a phantom, moving effortlessly through the massive urban sprawl of Los Angeles, striking again on May 14 in Monrovia, where he dragged a 41-year-old woman from her bed, sexually assaulted her, and forced her to perform oral sex on him while her bound son listened from the next room. A sadistic display of psychological torment that demonstrated Ramirez's absolute lack of empathy and his desire for total domination over his victims. As the summer of 1985 arrived, the attacks escalated to an almost frenzied pace, with Ramirez assaulting a woman in Burbank on May 29, binding her and her young son, raping her repeatedly, and then stealing their belongings before vanishing into the night, followed by an attack on a 65-year-old woman in Arcadia on June 1, whom he raped, beat, and sodomized before stealing her jewelry and fleeing. The breaking point for the city came in late June and early July, when Ramirez committed a series of attacks over a single weekend that paralyzed the entire region with fear, first attacking a woman in her home in Sierra Madre on June 27, then invading a home in Arcadia on June 29, where he pistol-whipped a man and sexually assaulted his girlfriend, and finally, on July 2, entering an apartment in Monterey Park where he brutally beat and raped a woman before forcing her to swear her love to Satan. The Los Angeles Police Department, under immense public pressure and intense media scrutiny, was struggling to contain the hysteria, a situation that was compounded on July 5 when Ramirez attacked a 16-year-old girl in Pico Rivera, binding her, raping her, and then shooting her in the head, miraculously leaving her alive but comatose, and then attacking another woman in the same city on July 7, raping and sodomizing her before shooting her in the head. Another miraculous survival. On July 20th, the nightmare reached its absolute peak when Ramirez broke into the home of 29-year-old Whitney Bennett in Arcadia, bludgeoning her with a tire iron, and then, in a bizarre twist, attempted to drag her unconscious body outside before a loud noise spooked him, causing him to flee, leaving behind a footprint that would eventually become crucial evidence. The investigation took a massive turn in August when a young woman named Virginia Garza, who had been carjacked and sexually assaulted by Ramirez on August 18, provided investigators with a detailed description of her attacker and managed to grab a piece of jewelry he had dropped, a gold ring bearing the initials J and D, while on August 24, Ramirez committed his final attack in the San Francisco area, shooting 27-year-old Christopher Peterson and raping his fiancée, before fleeing in a stolen car, a critical mistake that would ultimately lead to his downfall. On August 25, 1985, the citizens of East Los Angeles were on edge, and when a man matching the composite sketch of the Night Stalker was spotted attempting to steal a car and then violently assault its owner, a group of residents chased him down the street, beating him and subduing him until police arrived, a dramatic citizen's arrest that ended the 14-month reign of terror. When detectives arrived at the scene and took the bloodied suspect into custody, they found in his possession a .22 caliber revolver, which was quickly forensically linked to the shootings of multiple victims, and the gold ring stolen from Whitney Bennett's home, which bore the initials of her father, Joseph D. Bennett, providing the irrefutable physical evidence that the Los Angeles Police Department had desperately needed. Richard Ramirez was formally charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, and as details of his satanic rituals, his forced allegiance to Satan at crime scenes, and his complete lack of remorse emerged, the media circus surrounding the case reached unprecedented levels, transforming Ramirez into an almost mythic figure of pure evil. The trial of Richard Ramirez began in 1989 and was one of the most chaotic and bizarre proceedings in American judicial history, marked by Ramirez's outrageous courtroom behavior, including his growling at witnesses, his drawing of pentagrams on his palm which he would flash to the jury, and the shocking moment when he leaned over to a juror and said, "Evil is eternal," prompting the juror to faint. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys Phil Halpin and Michael Arguello, presented a meticulously constructed case that included ballistic evidence, DNA analysis, eyewitness identifications, and the powerful testimony of survivors who recounted their horrifying ordeals, painting a portrait of a predatory killer who specifically targeted individuals who were asleep, alone, or otherwise physically vulnerable, exploiting their defenselessness to satisfy his violent and sadistic impulses. The defense, headed by Arturo Hernandez and Daniel Hernandez, attempted to argue that Ramirez was not guilty by reason of insanity, a strategy that completely fell apart when Ramirez himself fired his own attorneys at one point and demanded to represent himself, and when a court-appointed psychiatrist testified that while Ramirez suffered from antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse issues, he was legally sane and fully understood the criminality of his actions. On September 20, 1989, after deliberating for several days, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all 43 felony counts, and shortly thereafter, he was sentenced to die in the gas chamber, a verdict that Ramirez received with a chilling smile and a raised fist, shouting, "You guys have been a great audience," as he was led out of the courtroom. The broader implications of the Night Stalker case were profound and long-lasting, exposing the severe vulnerabilities in urban policing and the difficulty of tracking a highly mobile transient serial killer who operated across multiple jurisdictions without a clear pattern or victimology, leading to significant reforms in how law enforcement agencies shared information and coordinated multi-jurisdictional task forces. The case also had a devastating and lingering impact on the psychological landscape of Southern California, where an entire generation of residents installed heavy-duty security doors, purchased firearms, and suffered from chronic insomnia and anxiety, a pervasive sense of vulnerability that permanently altered the cultural fabric of the region. Richard Ramirez spent the next 24 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continued to embrace his satanic beliefs, reportedly receiving fan mail from hundreds of women around the world, some of whom he eventually married, a disturbing phenomenon that underscored the bizarre celebrity status often afforded to notorious criminals in American culture. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of natural causes at the age of 53 due to complications from B-cell lymphoma, a quiet and anticlimactic end for a man who had inflicted so much unimaginable pain and terror upon the most vulnerable people in Southern California, but a resolution that brought a final, definitive closure to the victims' families who had endured decades of appeals and legal limbo. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains a grim and cautionary tale in the annals of American criminal history, a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity and the devastating consequences of unchecked predatory violence against those who are simply trying to feel safe in their own homes. Number 2. Robert Hansen, the infamous butcher-baker of Alaska, who spent over a decade hunting down vulnerable women in the freezing wilderness of Anchorage, treating human beings as nothing more than wild game to be stalked, captured, and killed. Born in February of 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, Robert Christian Hansen grew up as a painfully shy, socially awkward child who was constantly ridiculed and bullied by his peers and strictly dominated by his authoritarian father. A deeply toxic environment that fostered a seething, internalized rage and a profound sense of inadequacy that would fester within him for his entire life. Hansen suffered from severe acne and a pronounced stutter throughout his adolescence, conditions that made him a perpetual outcast and fueled his intense hatred of women, whom he perceived as unattainable and cruel. A psychological dynamic that was only exacerbated by his early experiences with the criminal justice system when he was arrested in 1911 for burning down a school bus garage in Iowa, an act of petty arson that resulted in a brief stint in a mental institution. After marrying a young woman in 1960 and fathering 2 children, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, in 1967, seeking a fresh start in the rugged, isolated frontier, where he eventually opened a small, unassuming bakery that became a local staple and provided him with a perfect, unassuming cover for his dark, predatory double life. To the outside world, Hansen was a quiet, hard-working, if somewhat eccentric local businessman. But beneath his meek exterior lay a deeply disturbed sexual sadist who began frequenting the seedier bars and strip clubs of Anchorage's red light district, specifically targeting vulnerable young women, many of whom were sex workers, runaway teenagers, or struggling with substance abuse, populations that Hansen knew law enforcement would not prioritize if they suddenly disappeared. Hansen's known criminal history with women began in 1971 when he was arrested and convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a young woman, taking her to his cabin and terrorizing her at gunpoint, a crime for which he received an astonishingly lenient sentence of 5 years in prison, with only 3 years actually served, a staggering failure of the Alaskan justice system that directly enabled the subsequent murders of at least 17 women. Upon his release from prison in 1974, Hansen's behavior escalated from sexual predation to outright murder, a shift that went completely unnoticed by local authorities who had no idea they were dealing with a highly organized, methodical serial killer who had turned the vast, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness into his personal killing field. Hansen's methodology was chillingly systematic and drew heavily from his passion for hunting, a skill he had honed over years of stalking moose and bear in the dense Alaskan forests. He would approach a vulnerable woman in a bar, offer her money for sex or a ride, and then force her into his car at gunpoint, driving her deep into the remote wilderness outside of Anchorage where he knew the terrain intimately. Once in the remote wilderness, Hansen would strip his victims, sometimes bind them, and release them into the snow, giving them a head start before hunting them down with a high-powered hunting rifle, a terrifying game of cat and mouse that satisfied his deep-seated need for absolute power and control, transforming his profound feelings of social impotence into a godlike dominance over life and death. After shooting his victims, Hansen would typically sexually assault their corpses, a practice known as necrophilia, before burying them in shallow, unmarked graves scattered across a vast and desolate stretch of land near the Nick and Matanuska rivers, a rugged, muddy expanse that was nearly impossible to search without precise coordinates. For years, the disappearances of these women were treated by the Anchorage Police Department as isolated incidents, a reflection of the systemic apathy and institutionalized misogyny that plagued law enforcement's approach to missing sex workers during this era, an attitude that allowed Hansen to operate with absolute impunity, accumulating victims at a rate of roughly 2 per year between 1976 and 1983. The turning point in the investigation finally arrived in the fall of 1983, when a 17-year-old sex worker and exotic dancer named Cindy Paulson managed to escape from Hansen's clutches in a terrifying confrontation that would eventually unravel his entire murderous empire. Paulson had been abducted by Hansen, handcuffed and driven to his cabin, where she was terrorized and assaulted, but in a moment of incredible bravery and quick thinking, she managed to break free while Hansen was distracted. fleeing through the mud and onto a nearby highway where she flagged down a passing truck driver and was taken to the police station. Despite her detailed and consistent description of her attacker, his vehicle, and the route he had taken to the cabin, the Anchorage police initially dismissed Paulson's account, labeling her as an unreliable witness simply because of her profession, a devastatingly ignorant response that allowed Hansen to remain free and continue his predatory activities for several more months. It was only after a dedicated and visionary Alaska state trooper named Glenn Flo that took over the investigation into the growing number of missing women that a real breakthrough occurred. As Flo, recognizing a distinct pattern in the disappearances, began utilizing a groundbreaking new investigative tool called geographic profiling to map the dump sites of the few bodies that had been discovered in the wilderness. Flo reached out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically requesting the assistance of a pioneering criminal profiler named John Douglas, who, after analyzing the crime scenes, the victimology, and the geographic distribution of the dump sites, created a highly accurate psychological profile of the killer, describing him as a skilled hunter, an experienced outdoorsman, a subservient male who was dominated by women in his daily life, and a resident of Anchorage who suffered from a severe speech impediment, a profile that fit Robert Hansen with astonishing precision. Armed with Douglas's profile and Paulson's testimony, Flothy and his team secured a search warrant for Hansen's home and bakery, where they discovered a hidden trove of chilling evidence, including an extensive collection of firearms, a map of the Anchorage area with small X marks meticulously drawn on it in locations corresponding to the remote areas where bodies had been found, and a small aviation pilot's logbook that documented flights over those exact same coordinates on dates that coincided perfectly with the disappearances of multiple victims. Under intense interrogation, Hansen initially denied everything, but when confronted with the map, the flight logs, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence linking him to the dump sites, his carefully constructed facade of the meek baker crumbled, and he eventually confessed to the murders, leading investigators to the remote, frozen grave sites of 16 additional women who had vanished without a trace over the previous decade. In 1984, Robert Hansen pled guilty to 4 of the murders and was sentenced to 4 consecutive terms of life in prison plus 461 years without the possibility of parole, a sentence that spared the families of the victims the trauma of a prolonged public trial, but also denied them a full public accounting of the crimes committed against their loved ones. The Hansen case exposed the horrific systemic failures of the Alaskan criminal justice system, highlighting how the combination of institutionalized bias against sex workers, a lack of communication between local and state law enforcement agencies, and a culture of willful blindness allowed a prolific serial killer to operate in plain sight for over a decade. The broader implications of the investigation also revolutionized the use of criminal profiling and geographic profiling in serial murder cases, proving that understanding the spatial behavior of a killer could be as critical to solving a case as traditional forensic evidence like fingerprints or DNA. Robert Hansen spent the remaining 30 years of his life incarcerated at the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, where he was described by prison officials as a quiet, unassuming inmate who spent his time baking bread for the prison population and reading, a chillingly mundane existence for a man who had once hunted human beings for sport. On August 21, 2014, at the age of 75, Robert Hansen died of natural causes while still in custody, a quiet end that stood in stark contrast to the screams of terror that must have echoed through the frozen Alaskan wilderness as his victims ran for their lives, unarmed and barefoot in the snow, hunted by a man who found pleasure in their absolute vulnerability. The legacy of the Butcher Baker of Alaska remains a powerful and disturbing testament to the catastrophic consequences of ignoring the disappearances of society's most marginalized individuals and a stark reminder that evil does not always hide in the darkest corners of society, but can sometimes be found behind the counter of a local bakery, smiling politely at the customers it is secretly planning to destroy. Number 3. Joseph James DeAngelo, the elusive predator known as the Golden State Killer, who terrorized the entire state of California throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s, evolving from a serial burglar into one of the most prolific and terrifying sexual sadists and murderers in American history. Born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. grew up in a working-class family that eventually relocated to the Sacramento area of California, where he spent his formative years navigating a deeply troubled home environment marked by a severely abusive, alcoholic father and a sister who was allegedly sexually assaulted by military personnel. a background of profound dysfunction and trauma that psychological experts would later point to as the foundational soil from which his violent compulsions grew. D'Angelo joined the United States Navy after graduating high school and served during the Vietnam War era before utilizing the GI Bill to attend Sacramento State University, where he earned a degree in criminal justice and completed a police academy program, a deeply ironic educational path that would ultimately grant him an intimate, professional understanding of the exact investigative techniques and forensic limitations that law enforcement would later use in a futile attempt to catch him. In 1973, D'Angelo was hired as a police officer in the small suburban city of Exeter, California, where he spent 2 years patrolling the streets in uniform, a period during which he was highly regarded by his superiors as a competent and ambitious young officer, completely unaware of the monstrous, sadistic impulses that were already beginning to boil beneath his carefully maintained surface of normalcy. D'Angelo's criminal career officially began around 1974 in the Visalia area of California's Central Valley, where a series of residential burglaries committed by an unknown suspect who was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker targeted single-story homes, focusing almost exclusively on stealing items of a highly personal and intimate nature, such as women's underwear, photographs, and small keepsakes, a psychological signature that revealed a deeply voyeuristic and sexually deviant psychological profile. The Visalia Ransacker phase escalated dramatically on the night of September 11, 1975, when D'Angelo broke into the home of a local journalist named Claude Snelling, who was awakened by the sound of the intruder attempting to kidnap his 16-year-old daughter, leading to a violent physical confrontation where Snelling was shot and killed by the suspect, who fled into the darkness, marking D'Angelo's first known murder and a terrifying evolution from a mere thief into a violent predator. Shortly after the Snelling murder, D'Angelo moved to the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights and joined the Auburn Police Department, a jurisdictional shift that placed him right in the heart of the area where his next, even more terrifying criminal persona would emerge, a region that would soon come to know him by a name that would become synonymous with pure, unadulterated terror. Beginning in June of 1976, the suburban communities north of Sacramento were plagued by a masked intruder who would break into homes in the dead of night, often cutting phone lines and unlocking windows or sliding glass doors in advance, a level of meticulous pre-operational planning that demonstrated an intimate knowledge of home construction and a calculated strategy to maximize the vulnerability of his future victims. This perpetrator, dubbed the East Area Rapist by the terrified public and the media, exclusively targeted middle-class, single-family homes occupied by couples, specifically seeking out women who were alone or at home with only their husbands, a victimology that suggested a deep-seated resentment toward the traditional suburban domestic ideal and a desire to violently assert dominance over the patriarch of the household by subjugating and sexually assaulting his partner in front of him. The methodology of the East Area Rapist was excruciatingly consistent and designed to inflict maximum psychological terror. He would enter the home while the occupants were asleep, shine a flashlight in their faces, and wake them at gunpoint, using pre-cut bindings, typically shoelaces or twine, to tie up both the male and female victims with a level of speed and precision that indicated extensive practice. Once the victims were securely bound, D'Angelo would separate the woman from her partner, often placing dishes on the male victim's back and threatening to kill everyone in the house if he heard the dishes rattle. A sickeningly effective psychological torture technique that ensured the absolute immobilization and silent complicity of the male victim while D'Angelo spent hours sexually assaulting, humiliating, and degrading the female victim in another room. Over a period of roughly 2 years, the East Area Rapist struck more than 50 times in the Sacramento area, an unprecedented pace of predation that left entire neighborhoods paralyzed with fear, causing hardware stores to sell out of deadbolts, locks, and guns, and prompting the formation of massive citizen patrol groups that roamed the streets at night, desperately searching for a phantom who seemed to vanish into thin air. The investigation was massive and complex, involving dozens of detectives from multiple jurisdictions, but D'Angelo's professional knowledge of police procedures allowed him to consistently evade capture, utilizing counter-surveillance techniques, avoiding leaving fingerprints, and even firing a weapon at pursuing officers on 2 separate occasions without being apprehended, a cat-and-mouse game that deeply humiliated and frustrated law enforcement. In 1978, the attacks abruptly ceased in the Sacramento area, leading investigators to incorrectly believe the perpetrator had been arrested, killed, or simply moved away. But in reality, D'Angelo had simply shifted his hunting ground southward to the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically targeting communities in Contra Costa County, Alameda County, and Santa Clara County, where he continued his brutal campaign of sexual terror under the new moniker of the Night Stalker, a title he held until Richard Ramirez claimed it years later. Then, in 1979, the terror escalated to outright murder, beginning with the brutal killings of 22-year-old Katie Maggiore and her husband Brian in Rancho Cordova. A double homicide that shocked investigators who had previously believed the East Area rapist was solely a sexual predator who intentionally avoided lethal violence. As the 1980s arrived, D'Angelo's bloodlust fully consumed whatever remaining restraint he had possessed, leading to a horrific series of home invasion murders in Southern California, specifically in Orange County, where he bludgeoned and shot entire families to death in their beds, crimes that earned him yet another nickname, the original Night Stalker. Among his most devastating murders in the 1980s were the killings of Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta in 1981, the brutal murders of Manuela Withun in Irvine in 1981, the slaying of Janelle Cruz in Irvine in 1986, and the infamous attack on the Smith family in Ventura in 1980, all of which shared a terrifyingly consistent signature of extreme overkill, bludgeoning injuries inflicted with a pipe or crowbar, and a complete lack of useful forensic evidence left behind at the scene. For decades, the connection between the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker remained unproven, a massive failure of interagency communication that allowed the true scope of a single predator's rampage to remain hidden. But in 2001, a DNA breakthrough finally linked the Southern California murders to the Northern California rapes, confirming that one man had been responsible for over 50 sexual assaults and at least 13 murders across the entire state of California. Despite this monumental genetic revelation, the killer's identity remained a complete mystery for another 17 years, as investigators had no matching DNA profile in any criminal database, leading them to employ a revolutionary new technique called forensic genetic genealogy, a process where an unknown DNA sample is uploaded to public genealogy websites in an attempt to identify distant relatives of the suspect. In April of 2018, a team of investigators and genealogists successfully traced the crime scene DNA to a familial match, which ultimately led them to a 72-year-old retired police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo, who was living quietly in a suburb of Sacramento, just miles away from the neighborhoods he had terrorized 40 years earlier. On April 18, 2018, a surveillance team obtained a discarded tissue from D'Angelo's trash can, tested the DNA, and confirmed an absolute match to the Golden State Killer, leading to his immediate arrest and bringing an end to one of the longest and most frustrating manhunts in the history of American law enforcement. In June of 2020, facing an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable DNA evidence, Joseph James D'Angelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of sexual assaults and burglaries as part of a plea agreement that spared him the death penalty, a pragmatic legal outcome that nonetheless deeply angered many of the surviving victims and the families of those he had murdered who wanted to see him executed. The judge sentenced D'Angelo to multiple consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, remarking during the sentencing hearing that he had never seen a case with such an unprecedented level of criminality, and that D'Angelo had committed acts of pure evil that had stolen the innocence of an entire state. The broader implications of the Golden State Killer case are immense, as it fundamentally revolutionized the field of forensic science by proving that genetic genealogy could be used to solve cold cases that had exhausted all traditional investigative methods, a technique that has since been used to identify and apprehend dozens of other serial rapists and murderers across the country. The case also exposed the terrifying reality of police impunity, as D'Angelo's status as a sworn law enforcement officer not only provided him with the skills to evade capture, but also protected him from initial suspicion, a devastating institutional failure that forced a profound reckoning within the law enforcement community regarding the vetting and monitoring of its own personnel. The impact on the victims and their families has been profound and permanent, as decades of living with unanswered questions, chronic PTSD, and the paralyzing fear that the monster who destroyed their lives was still out there were only partially alleviated by D'Angelo's arrest and confession, a bittersweet resolution that could never fully undo the psychological damage inflicted during those dark nights in the 1970s and 1980s. Today, Joseph James D'Angelo sits in a maximum security cell in a California prison, an old, frail man serving a sentence of life without parole. A far cry from the athletic, masked predator who once haunted the dreams of millions of Californians, but a physical manifestation of the enduring truth that even the most intelligent, disciplined, and calculating predators can ultimately be brought to justice through persistence, science, and an unwavering commitment to the victims. Number 4. Otis Toole, a deeply disturbed drifter and arsonist who, alongside his partner Henry Lee Lucas, embarked on a horrific, cross-country murder spree in the 1970s and early 1980s, preying on some of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of society, including hitchhikers, sex workers, and transient children. Born in 1947 in Jacksonville, Florida, Otis Elwood Toole grew up in an environment of almost incomprehensible depravity and abuse, raised in a dilapidated shack by an abusive, alcoholic mother who frequently dressed him in girls' clothing and subjected him to severe physical beatings, and a father who was largely absent, leaving young Otis to fend for himself on the violent, impoverished streets of Jacksonville. Toole's grandmother, a devout practitioner of hoodoo and folk magic, further warped his developing psyche by introducing him to bizarre religious rituals and Satanism, claiming that he was destined to become a devil child. A horrific label that the deeply disturbed young boy internalized and ultimately embraced as a core aspect of his identity. By the time he was a teenager, Toole had dropped out of school entirely and was engaging in severe acts of delinquency, including petty theft, vandalism, and a compulsive obsession with fire setting, a destructive impulse that would remain a central pillar of his criminal psychology for the rest of his life, leading him to eventually admit to having committed over 1,000 arsons across the United States. Toole's sexuality was deeply confused and profoundly deviant from an early age, and he would later claim to have engaged in his first act of necrophilia at the age of 14, a claim that, given his later confirmed behaviors, horrified investigators and psychologists alike, painting a portrait of a human being who had completely detached from any conventional understanding of empathy, morality, or human connection. In 1976, while hitchhiking in Florida, Otis Toole met a fellow drifter named Henry Lee Lucas, a man whose own childhood was equally marred by extreme abuse and violence, and the two men quickly formed a deeply codependent, romantic, and criminal partnership that would become one of the most lethal alliances in the history of American serial murder. Operating primarily out of Florida but traveling extensively across the American South and Southwest, Toole and Lucas began a nomadic lifestyle funded by petty crime and punctuated by acts of random, gratuitous violence, targeting individuals who existed on the absolute fringes of society, people who would not be immediately missed and whose disappearances would not generate significant law enforcement attention. Toole's preferred method of murder was arson, a reflection of his lifelong pyromania, and he frequently boasted to investigators about setting his victims on fire while they were still alive, claiming that the sounds they made and the way they moved in the flames gave him an intense sexual gratification that he could not achieve through any other means. He was also a known cannibal, admitting to consuming parts of his victims' bodies after killing them, a grotesque practice that he framed not as an act of hunger but as a spiritual ritual that allowed him to absorb the life force of his prey, a twisted, delusional justification that provided a window into the profoundly shattered and psychotic nature of his mind. While many of Toole's confessions regarding Henry Lee Lucas were later proven to be exaggerated or completely fabricated, a common occurrence with Lucas, who became a notorious confessor, investigators were able to independently verify several murders that Toole unequivocally committed on his own, separate from his partnership with Lucas. One of Toole's most heinous and verified crimes was the murder of 19-year-old George Sonnenberg in 1981, whom Toole shot, mutilated, and then set on fire inside a mobile home in Florida, a crime for which he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life in prison due to his intellectual disabilities and mental instability. Toole was also the primary suspect in the horrific murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, the son of America's most wanted host John Walsh, a case that shocked the conscience of the nation and forever changed the way American society viewed child safety and the reality of predatory strangers. In July of 1981, Adam Walsh was abducted from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida, and his severed head was recovered 2 weeks later in a drainage canal in Vero Beach, a devastating discovery that launched a massive, highly publicized investigation that initially failed to identify a definitive suspect. Otis Toole, who was well known to local law enforcement as a dangerous drifter and convicted arsonist, repeatedly confessed to the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh over the course of several years, providing investigators with details about the crime scene, the route he took, and the method of murder that were disturbingly consistent with the known facts of the case, but his confessions were marred by inconsistencies and retractions, leading authorities to dismiss him as an unreliable attention seeker for over 2 decades. It was not until December of 2008, 27 years after Adams' murder, that the Hollywood Police Department, under intense public pressure and a comprehensive re-examination of the evidence, officially closed the case and named Otis Toole as the sole perpetrator, a belated and deeply emotional declaration of closure for John Walsh and his wife Reve, who had spent nearly 3 decades fighting for justice for their son. The investigation into Toole's crimes was severely hampered by his profound lack of credibility as a witness, his constant lying, his intellectual limitations, and the sheer, chaotic volume of his confessions, which ranged from verifiable truths to elaborate, fantastical fabrications involving secret satanic cults and nationwide conspiracies that he had completely invented in his own deeply disturbed mind. Toole's trial for the murder of George Sonnenberg was a chaotic spectacle, marked by his erratic courtroom behavior, his bizarre outbursts, and his constant threats against the judge and the jury, a performance that culminated in his conviction and a death sentence that was never carried out due to a series of legal appeals and a recognition by the state of Florida that his mental competency was highly questionable. The broader implications of the Otis Toole case are deeply disturbing, as it highlights the catastrophic failures of a criminal justice system that allows severely mentally ill, intellectually disabled, and profoundly dangerous individuals to slip through the cracks of the institutional safety net, drifting freely across state lines and preying upon the most defenseless members of society without consequence. The case also exposed the devastating consequences of institutional apathy toward missing and murdered marginalized individuals, as Toole specifically targeted people whom he knew society would not aggressively search for, exploiting the systemic biases of law enforcement to continue his reign of terror. Otis Toole spent his final years incarcerated at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, where he died on September 15, 1996, at the age of 49, succumbing to cirrhosis of the liver, a quiet, undignified death in a prison cell that stood in stark contrast to the horrific screaming agony he inflicted upon his victims in the flames of his own sadistic creation. The legacy of Otis Toole is one of unrelenting darkness, a grim reminder that true evil does not always manifest in the form of a highly intelligent, calculating mastermind, but can sometimes take the shape of a damaged, wandering, and deeply broken human being who is completely surrendered to the most depraved and violent impulses of the human condition, leaving behind a trail of ashes, grief, and unresolved trauma that continues to haunt the families of his victims to this day. Number 5. Larry Eyler, the brutally efficient and deeply troubled serial killer known as the Interstate Killer, who prowled the highways of the American Midwest in the early 1980s, targeting young, vulnerable gay men and teenage boys who were simply trying to find connection in a society that actively marginalized and persecuted them. Born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, Larry William Eyler was raised in a deeply conservative, rural environment by a single mother who worked tirelessly to support her family, but who was completely unequipped to handle the profound psychological complexities of her son, who struggled with his homosexual identity from a very young age in a community and an era where being gay was considered a severe moral failing and a criminal offense. Eyler's internalized shame and confusion regarding his sexuality manifested in severe behavioral problems throughout his adolescence, including petty theft, vandalism, and a deeply troubling pattern of cruelty toward animals, a classic psychological red flag for extreme antisocial personality disorder that went completely unrecognized and untreated by the adults in his life. After a brief and disastrous stint in the United States Army, where he was subjected to intense harassment and abuse due to his sexual orientation, Eyler returned to Indiana and attempted to build a normal life, attending college and eventually becoming a teacher, a profession that placed him in direct, daily contact with the exact demographic of young males that he would eventually begin to prey upon. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Eyler was living a highly compartmentalized double life. To his colleagues and neighbors, he was a mild-mannered, well-spoken educator, but within the hidden, underground gay bar scene of Indianapolis and Chicago, he was a highly active, deeply disturbed individual who used his physical attractiveness and his position of authority to lure vulnerable young men into his vehicle. Eyler's killing spree officially began around 1982, a period that coincided with the collapse of a deeply toxic, codependent relationship he was involved in with a significantly older man named John Dobrovolsky, a relationship that exacerbated Eiler's already fragile psychological state and pushed him over the edge from a confused, self-loathing individual into a full-blown, homicidal sexual sadist. The methodology of the interstate killer was chillingly consistent and ruthlessly efficient. Eiler would cruise the gay bars of Chicago, Indianapolis, Terre Haute, and other Midwestern cities, seeking out young men, often runaways, prostitutes, or individuals who were deeply closeted and terrified of being exposed, populations that he knew with absolute certainty would not be immediately reported missing by anyone in positions of authority. Once Eiler had isolated his victim and convinced them to get into his vehicle, he would drive them to a remote, pre-selected location, typically a rural roadside, a forest preserve, or an abandoned field, where he would overpower them, bind them with rope or tape, and then subject them to hours of extreme, horrific torture before ultimately killing them. The autopsy reports of Eiler's victims revealed a level of sadistic brutality that shocked even the most seasoned medical examiners in the Midwest. As the bodies bore evidence of severe beatings, repeated stabbing, deep lacerations, and extreme sexual trauma, including the insertion of foreign objects into the victims' bodies, a pattern of escalating violence that indicated Eiler's increasing need for more intense stimuli to achieve sexual gratification. Between 1982 and 1984, Eiler is believed to have murdered at least 23 young men, dumping their bodies in a massive geographic arc that stretched from Indiana to Illinois, Wisconsin, and Kentucky, earning him the moniker of the interstate killer due to his heavy reliance on the Midwest's vast highway system to transport his victims and dispose of their remains across multiple state jurisdictions. The multi-jurisdictional nature of Eiler's crimes created a massive investigative nightmare for local police departments, who initially treated the bodies discovered in their respective counties as isolated homicides, failing to connect the dots between the remote dump sites in Indiana and those found in the suburbs of Chicago, a failure of interagency communication that allowed Eiler to continue killing with relative impunity for over 2 years. The breakthrough in the case finally arrived in the fall of 1983 when Eiler made a critical error in judgment. After picking up a young man named Craig Townsend in a Chicago gay bar, he drove him to a remote area in Lake County, Indiana, and attacked him, but Townsend managed to fight off his attacker, escape from the vehicle, and flag down a passing motorist, providing police with a detailed description of Eiler and his distinctive vehicle. Based on Townsend's identification, police in Indiana arrested Larry Eiler in October of 1983 and charged him with attempted murder and kidnapping, a major setback for the killer that temporarily halted his murder spree but ultimately failed to connect him to the growing number of bodies being discovered across the Midwest. While Eiler was out on bail pending his trial for the Townsend abduction, the bodies continued to appear, including a horrific discovery in May of 1984 when the decomposed remains of 4 young men were found in a single, shallow grave in a rural area near Lake Village, Indiana, a mass grave that finally forced investigators from multiple states to formally collaborate and acknowledge that they were dealing with a single, highly mobile serial killer. The sheer volume of evidence eventually caught up with Eiler when, in September of 1984, he was pulled over by police in Chicago for a minor traffic violation, and officers noticed a bloody rope, a knife, and a hatchet in the back seat of his car, leading to his immediate arrest and a comprehensive search of his vehicle and apartment that yielded a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, including items belonging to several of the murder victims. Despite the overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the murders, the prosecution's case was severely complicated by the fact that the bodies had been discovered across multiple states, forcing individual counties to file separate murder charges. A fragmented legal approach that ultimately resulted in Eiler standing trial only for the murder of a 15-year-old boy named Danny Bridges in Cook County, Illinois. In 1986, the trial of Larry Eiler was a landmark moment in the history of American criminal justice, as it was one of the first high-profile serial murder cases to heavily utilize DNA evidence to link a suspect to multiple victims, a scientific breakthrough that provided the irrefutable proof of guilt that had eluded investigators in previous decades. The prosecution presented a devastating case that detailed Eiler's horrific torture of Danny Bridges, including evidence that the young boy had been bound, gagged, repeatedly stabbed, and sexually mutilated over a period of several hours before finally succumbing to his injuries, a level of depravity that left the jury with no reasonable doubt whatsoever regarding the defendant's guilt. In October of 1986, Larry Eiler was found guilty of the murder of Danny Bridges and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. a verdict that brought a measure of closure to the families of the victims in Illinois but left the families of the victims in Indiana and other states frustrated that Eiler would never face trial for the murders of their loved ones. While sitting on death row in Illinois, Eiler underwent a profound psychological transformation, largely facilitated by a dedicated defense investigator and a forensic psychologist who spent hundreds of hours interviewing him, eventually convincing Eiler to confess to the remaining murders in exchange for a formal agreement that his confessions would not be used to seek the death penalty in other jurisdictions. In a series of incredibly detailed and chilling confessions, Eiler admitted to murdering 23 young men, providing investigators with precise details about the killings, the torture methods, and the locations of the dump sites that only the perpetrator could have known. A massive cathartic release of truth that finally provided answers to the families of the missing and closed the books on one of the most prolific murder sprees in Midwestern history. However, Eiler's confessions also contained a deeply disturbing and highly controversial bombshell, as he claimed that he had not acted alone in several of the murders, but had been assisted by a prominent, well-connected Chicago criminal defense attorney named J.C. Smith, who, according to Eiler, had participated in the torture and killings and had used his legal expertise to help Eiler evade capture. This accusation against J.C. Smith caused a massive scandal in the Chicago legal community, but it was never formally prosecuted, as Eiler died of AIDS-related complications on March 6, 1994, while still on death row, taking the full, unvarnished truth of his allegations to his grave and leaving a lingering cloud of suspicion and conspiracy over the case that persists to this day. The broader implications of the Larry Eiler case are profound, as it exposed the extreme vulnerability of the LGBTQ+ community in the 1980s, a time when the AIDS epidemic was ravaging the population and systemic homophobia within law enforcement meant that the murders of gay men were not investigated with the same urgency or resources as the murders of heterosexual victims. The case also demonstrated the devastating limitations of a fragmented, jurisdiction-based policing system in the face of a highly mobile serial killer, a lesson that eventually led to the creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, commonly known as VICAP, a federal database designed to track patterns in serial violent crimes across state lines. Larry Eiler's legacy is a grim and tragic one, a story of a deeply damaged human being whose internalized self-hatred and untreated psychological disorders metastasized into a campaign of horrific violence against the very community he belonged to, leaving behind a trail of shattered families, unmarked graves, and a profound scar on the history of the American Midwest that serves as a stark reminder of the deadly consequences of societal prejudice and institutional indifference. Number 6. Carlton Gary, the terrifying and elusive predator known as the Stocking Strangler, who terrorized the elderly African-American community of Columbus, Georgia, in the late 1970s, a killing spree that was not fully brought to justice until the mid-1980s due to a catastrophic failure of the local criminal justice system. Born in 1952 in Columbus, Georgia, Carlton Gary grew up in the city's impoverished, racially segregated neighborhoods, a deeply disadvantaged environment that offered him few opportunities for advancement and exposed him to the pervasive systemic racism and economic inequality that defined the American South during the era of Jim Crow and its long, lingering aftermath. From a very young age, Gary exhibited a severe lack of impulse control and a profound propensity for violence, beginning his criminal career as a juvenile with a series of escalating property crimes, including burglaries and auto thefts, that ultimately culminated in a brutal home invasion in 1970 where he violently assaulted a woman, a crime that resulted in a prison sentence that did absolutely nothing to rehabilitate him and only served to further harden his criminal tendencies. Upon his release from prison, Gary returned to Columbus, but his criminal behavior immediately resumed, leading him to flee the state to avoid arrest and embarking on a nomadic journey across the eastern United States that included stops in New York, Connecticut, and South Carolina, where he committed a series of burglaries and violent assaults that would later prove crucial to establishing his geographic pattern of predation. By 1977, Carlton Gary had returned to Columbus, Georgia, and it was during this period that his criminal behavior underwent a terrifying and lethal evolution, as the cat burglar transformed into a serial killer who specifically targeted the most vulnerable and defenseless segment of the local population: elderly African-American women living alone in the city's older, poorly secured neighborhoods. The methodology of the Stocking Strangler was as calculated as it was horrifying. Gary would surveil his elderly victims for days, learning their routines and the layouts of their homes, before gaining entry either by force or by simple manipulation, such as posing as a utility worker or simply walking through an unlocked door, a reflection of the trust and lack of paranoia that characterized a generation of Southerners who had grown up in a safer, more community-oriented era. Once inside the home, Gary's primary weapon of choice was a stocking or a piece of ligature, which he would wrap around the victim's throat and pull with immense force, strangling them to death in a slow, agonizingly deliberate process that demonstrated a profound capacity for sustained, intimate violence and a complete detachment from the suffering of another human being. In addition to the strangulation, many of Gary's victims showed clear signs of severe sexual assault, indicating that the killings were driven by a deeply sadistic sexual compulsion that required the total physical subjugation and ultimate destruction of a vulnerable, defenseless woman to achieve gratification. The first victim attributed to the stocking strangler was 60-year-old Mary Willis Fernandez, who was found strangled and sexually assaulted in her home in September of 1977. A horrific crime that sent a wave of panic through the elderly African-American community, but was initially treated by the Columbus Police Department as an isolated, tragic incident. Over the next 7 months, the killer struck with terrifying regularity, murdering 6 more elderly women, ranging in age from 64 to 89, including Fern Jackson, Jean Dimension, Milton Marlowe, Kathleen Woodruff, Laureen Stallings, and Octavia Smith, each victim found strangled, often with their own stockings and left in grotesque, posed positions that suggested a deep psychological need to dominate and humiliate even after death. The sheer brutality of the crimes and the extreme vulnerability of the victims created a climate of absolute terror within Columbus, particularly among the elderly, who installed multiple locks on their doors, took in boarders, and purchased firearms, completely reshaping their daily lives in a desperate attempt to defend themselves against a phantom who seemed able to strike at will without leaving a single clue. The investigation into the stocking strangler murders was massively flawed from the very beginning, hampered by the systemic racism of the era, a profound lack of resources, and a complete failure by the Columbus Police Department to recognize the pattern of the killings until multiple bodies had already accumulated, a staggering investigative incompetence that allowed Gary to operate with absolute impunity for months. The initial suspects in the case were exclusively African-American men from the local community, many of whom were rounded up, interrogated without proper legal representation, and forced to provide hair and blood samples in a Dragnet-style investigation that violated the civil rights of hundreds of innocent citizens but completely failed to identify the actual killer. By early 1978, the murders abruptly stopped, and the case went completely cold, remaining unsolved for several years while Carlton Gary continued his life of crime in other states, committing a series of burglaries and a brutal rape in Syracuse, New York, in 1978, a crime that would eventually provide the critical forensic link needed to solve the stocking strangler case. In 1986, a dedicated investigator named Rufus Burks, who had been working the cold case files in Columbus, discovered a critical piece of evidence that had been sitting in storage for years: a semen sample collected from the body of one of the victims, which, thanks to the recent advent of forensic serology, was typed to a specific blood antigen profile that narrowed the suspect pool significantly. Simultaneously, Gary was arrested in Syracuse, New York, for a burglary, and his blood type was found to match the serological profile of the semen recovered from the Columbus murder victim, a tenuous but groundbreaking scientific link that gave investigators the probable cause they needed to finally bring him in for questioning. In a desperate and highly unethical attempt to secure a confession, Columbus police officers flew to New York, intercepted Gary during a prison transfer, and interrogated him in a motel room for hours without reading him his Miranda rights or allowing him access to an attorney, an egregious violation of constitutional procedure that ultimately provided them with a taped confession that Gary immediately attempted to repudiate once he realized he had been manipulated. The trial of Carlton Gary began in 1986 and was immediately embroiled in massive controversy, as Gary's defense team aggressively attacked the legality of the motel room confession and argued that the serological evidence was statistically weak and racially biased, pointing out that the blood type profile matched a significant percentage of the African-American male population in the South. Despite the severe procedural irregularities and the questionable nature of the forensic evidence, the all-white jury found Carlton Gary guilty of 3 of the stocking strangler murders and sentenced him to death, a verdict that was deeply divisive within the Columbus community, with many believing that Gary was a monster who deserved to die, while others, particularly within the African American community, believed he was a victim of a racist system that had railroaded an innocent man to close a highly embarrassing cold case. For the next 3 decades, Gary sat on death row in a Georgia prison, filing endless appeals that slowly worked their way through the state and federal court systems, while a growing coalition of civil rights activists, forensic experts, and legal scholars took up his cause, arguing that the evidence used to convict him was deeply flawed and that the true killer might still be at large. The broader implications of the Carlton Gary case are deeply unsettling, as it highlights the catastrophic consequences of a criminal justice system that allows racial bias to dictate the direction of a murder investigation, leading to the tunnel vision of suspects and the systemic exclusion of alternative theories that could have identified the killer much sooner. The case also exposed the devastating vulnerability of the elderly, a demographic that is often overlooked in discussions of violent crime, but which is uniquely susceptible to predation due to physical frailty, social isolation, and a generational reluctance to report suspicious activity to the authorities. After exhausting all of his appeals, Carlton Gary was executed by lethal injection on March 15, 2018, at the age of 65, maintaining his innocence to the very end and pointing the finger at other suspects whose names had been present in the original police files but were never adequately investigated. The execution of Carlton Gary brought a highly controversial and deeply contested end to a case that had haunted the city of Columbus for over 40 years, leaving behind a fractured legacy of unresolved doubt, lingering racial trauma, and a profound sadness for the families of the elderly women whose final moments on earth were filled with unimaginable terror and pain at the hands of a predator who saw their vulnerability not as a reason for mercy, but as an invitation to kill. Number 7. Charles Ng, one half of a depraved and horrifying killing duo that operated out of a remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California in the early 1980s, preying on a wide range of vulnerable individuals who were lured to their deaths under the false pretense of buying cheap goods or finding employment. Born on December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong, Charles Chi-Tat Ng was the son of a wealthy Chinese businessman, a privileged upbringing that afforded him a private school education and every material advantage, but which utterly failed to instill within him even the most basic levels of human empathy or moral restraint. Ng's adolescent years were marked by severe behavioral problems, including an obsession with weapons, a fascination with Nazi propaganda, and a blatant disregard for authority, traits that eventually led his father to send him to a strict boarding school in England, an attempt at discipline that only further alienated the deeply troubled young man and pushed him toward an ideology of extreme violence and absolute self-determination. In 1977, at the age of 17, Ng moved to the United States to attend college in California, but he quickly dropped out of school and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, a decision driven not by patriotism but by a desire to gain access to military-grade weaponry and combat training, a calculation that proved accurate when he was arrested and court-martialed in 1980 for stealing military equipment, including explosives and heavy machine guns, crimes that resulted in a stint in a military prison. After his release from the brig, Ng's criminal behavior escalated rapidly, culminating in a shoplifting arrest in 1982 in San Francisco, where he was caught stealing a vice from a hardware store, an incredibly petty crime that would ironically serve as the catalyst for one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history, as it was while out on bail for this minor offense that Ng moved into a remote cabin in Wilseyville, Calaveras County, and met the man who would become his partner in unimaginable depravity, Leonard Lake. Leonard Lake was a deeply disturbed, heavily built man with a history of mental illness, extreme misogyny, and a bizarre neo-fascist philosophy he called Operation Miranda, a delusional manifesto that detailed his plans to kidnap young women, enslave them in an underground bunker, and use them as breeding stock to repopulate the world after an impending nuclear apocalypse, a fantasy that Ng eagerly embraced and helped to operationalize. The remote cabin in Wilseyville, which sat on a sprawling, heavily wooded piece of property owned by Lake's ex-wife, was quickly transformed into a fortified compound of horrors, equipped with a custom-built dungeon, a stash of stolen military weapons, and a sophisticated video recording system that Lake and Ng used to document their atrocities for their own twisted, sadistic pleasure. Between 1983 and 1985, Ng and Lake lured numerous victims to the cabin, using a variety of deceptive strategies that exploited the vulnerabilities of their targets, including running fake classified ads selling expensive electronics, furniture, and cars at impossibly low prices, and promising room and board to vulnerable young men and women who were drifters or runaways. Once the victims arrived at the cabin, they were immediately overpowered, disarmed, and forced into the underground bunker, where they were subjected to unspeakable acts of torture, sexual degradation, and psychological terror, all of which was meticulously recorded on videotape by Lake and Ng, who would often force their victims to read from a scripted confession or manifesto before killing them. Among the confirmed victims of the Ng and Lake killing duo were Harvey Dubbs and his wife Brenda O'Connor, along with their infant son Sean, who were lured to the cabin under the pretense of purchasing a used car and were subsequently murdered, as well as a young man named Lonnie Bond, his girlfriend Brenda, and their infant child, all of whom were tortured, killed, and buried on the property. The absolute indifference that Ng and Lake showed toward the extreme vulnerability of their victims, particularly the infants, demonstrated a level of psychopathic depravity that shocked even the most hardened homicide detectives in California, a complete and total absence of human compassion that bordered on the demonic. The killing spree finally came to an end in June of 1985 in a remarkably mundane and anticlimactic fashion. Ng and Lake were inside a hardware store in South San Francisco when a clerk noticed Ng attempting to shoplift a device, an echo of the exact same petty crime that had brought the two men together years earlier, leading to a confrontation with store security and the arrival of the police. When officers attempted to arrest Ng, Lake handed them a driver's license with a fake name and tried to calm the situation. But when the officers discovered that Lake was driving a vehicle that belonged to one of their missing murder victims, he was detained and separated from Ng, who managed to flee the scene on foot and disappear into the crowded streets of San Francisco. While sitting in the holding cell at the police station, Leonard Lake, realizing that his decades-long fantasy of torture and murder was finally collapsing around him, swallowed a cyanide pill that he had sewn into the collar of his shirt, slipping into a coma and dying 4 days later in a local hospital, a cowardly suicide that left Charles Ng as the sole surviving suspect in one of the most complex and horrific mass murder cases in California history. The subsequent investigation of the Wilseyville cabin by the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office yielded a nightmare of epic proportions, as investigators excavated the property and discovered a massive, clandestine graveyard containing the remains of at least 12 victims, including the infants, as well as a horrifying collection of videotapes, photographs, and written journals that documented the systematic torture, rape, and murder of human beings in excruciating, graphic detail. The discovery of the bunker and the tapes sent a shockwave of revulsion across the nation, but the task of bringing Charles Ng to justice was only just beginning, as the killer had vanished without a trace, prompting a massive international manhunt that would span several continents and last for 6 years. Ng's flight from justice took him to Canada, where he managed to avoid detection for several months before being arrested in 1985 in Calgary, Alberta, for shoplifting, an astonishing inability to control his petty thievery that once again proved to be his ultimate downfall. The Canadian authorities, unaware of the magnitude of the crimes Ng was suspected of committing in California, tried and convicted him on the shoplifting charge and sentenced him to 4 years in a Canadian penitentiary, a devastating bureaucratic delay that allowed Ng to avoid facing murder charges in the United States for several additional years while a complex, multi-year extradition battle played out in the international courts. Ng fought his extradition to California with an army of high-priced lawyers, exploiting every possible legal loophole and procedural technicality to delay his return to the United States, a strategy that cost the taxpayers of California millions of dollars and caused immense emotional distress to the families of the victims, who were forced to endure years of legal limbo, while the man who had tortured and murdered their loved ones sat comfortably in a Canadian prison. In 1991, after the Supreme Court of Canada finally denied his final appeal, Charles Ng was extradited to California, where he was formally charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder, a legal proceeding that would go on to become one of the longest, most expensive, and most frustrating criminal trials in the history of the American judicial system. The trial of Charles Ng, which finally began in 1998, 13 years after the bodies were discovered at the Wilseyville cabin, was a masterclass in legal obstruction and defense manipulation, as Ng, who chose to act as his own co-counsel alongside his public defender, filed thousands of frivolous motions, demanded constant delays, and succeeded in dragging the proceedings out for over 8 months of actual courtroom time. The prosecution presented the horrific videotapes and photographs found at the cabin, along with the physical evidence recovered from the mass graves, and the testimony of forensic experts who definitively linked Ng to the murders through fingerprints, DNA, and ballistics, an overwhelmingly conclusive case that left absolutely no reasonable doubt as to his guilt. In 1999, after a trial that had cost the state of California an estimated $14 million, the jury found Charles Ng guilty on all 12 counts of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to death, a verdict that Ng received with his characteristic lack of emotion or remorse. The broader implications of the Charles Ng case are deeply disturbing, as it exposed the terrifying reality that highly organized, deeply depraved individuals can establish literal dungeons of horror in remote areas of the country and operate for years without detection, preying upon the vulnerable, the trusting, and the desperate who are simply looking for a good deal or a place to stay. The case also highlighted the profound limitations and exorbitant costs of the American death penalty system, as Ng's endless legal maneuvers demonstrated how a wealthy, dedicated defendant can exploit the constitutional protections of the appellate system to delay justice for decades. A deeply cynical manipulation of the law by a man who showed absolutely no respect for the lives or rights of his victims. Today, Charles Ng remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California, an aging, quiet inmate who has spent the last 25 years in a small cell, a far cry from the fortified bunker of horrors where he once held the power of life and death over innocent, vulnerable human beings, but a permanent, inescapable monument to the absolute failure of humanity that he represents. Number 8. Alton Coleman, an incredibly dangerous and highly mobile predatory killer who, alongside his female accomplice Deborah Brown, embarked on a horrific, 53-day killing spree across 6 Midwestern states in the summer of 1984, leaving a trail of dead and traumatized victims in their wake that shattered any remaining illusions about the capacity for evil within the human species. Born on November 6, 1955, in Danville, Illinois, Alton Coleman grew up in an environment of profound poverty, neglect, and abuse that was exacerbated by severe cognitive and psychological deficits, including an extremely low IQ that placed him in the borderline intellectual disability range and a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder that went completely untreated throughout his childhood and adolescence. From a very young age, Coleman exhibited a terrifying pattern of predatory behavior, including the sexual assault of a young child when he was only a teenager, a crime that should have served as a massive red flag for the criminal justice system, but which instead resulted in a series of lenient sentences and quick releases that utterly failed to protect the public from a rapidly escalating psychopath. By the early 1980s, Coleman had cultivated a highly effective and deeply sinister method of manipulating those around him, using his soft-spoken demeanor, his unassuming physical appearance, and his ability to project a false sense of harmlessness to gain the trust of his neighbors and the families in his community, a mask of normalcy that he would ultimately weaponize to devastating effect. The critical turning point in Coleman's criminal evolution was his relationship with Deborah Brown, a woman who was 15 years his junior and who suffered from her own severe psychological issues, including a dependent personality disorder that made her completely subservient to Coleman's will, transforming her from a passive observer into an active, willing participant in some of the most horrific acts of violence imaginable. On May 29, 1984, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown launched their campaign of terror from their home base in Waukegan, Illinois, by kidnapping and murdering a 9-year-old girl named Vernita Wheat, whom Coleman had lured away from her neighborhood under the pretense of buying her a snack, a horrifying abduction that went unnoticed for several days until her decomposed body was discovered in an abandoned building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The murder of Vernita Wheat was merely the opening act in a killing spree that defied all conventional understanding of serial predator behavior, as Coleman and Brown did not hide in the shadows or operate in a single, familiar territory, but instead embarked on a relentless, almost frenzied journey across the Midwest, moving from state to state with terrifying speed, utilizing the trust of strangers to secure food, shelter, and ultimately, their next victims. In early June, the duo traveled to Gary, Indiana, where they befriended a young woman named Donna Williams, gaining entry to her home before beating her to death and stealing her car, which they then used to drive to Detroit, Michigan, where they encountered a 7-year-old boy named Tamika Turks, whom they brutally raped, beat, and left for dead in a vacant lot, a crime that miraculously did not result in the child's death but left her with permanent, life-altering injuries. From Detroit, Coleman and Brown continued their erratic, multi-state flight, traveling to Ohio, where they committed a series of home invasions and assaults, including the brutal murder of a 44-year-old woman named Virginia Temple and her teenage daughter, Rena, in their home in Toledo, a double homicide that was discovered only after Coleman and Brown had moved on to their next target in a completely different city. The sheer mobility and unpredictability of Coleman and Brown's spree created an unprecedented investigative challenge for law enforcement agencies across 6 states, as local police departments were forced to deal with a moving target that was committing multiple murders, rapes, and kidnappings in rapid succession across jurisdictions that had no mechanism for real-time communication or coordination. The duo's methodology for gaining access to their victims was chillingly effective and heavily reliant upon their ability to exploit the kindness and inherent vulnerability of ordinary, trusting people. They would frequently approach strangers on the street or knock on doors in residential neighborhoods, posing as stranded motorists, traveling missionaries, or distant relatives who needed a place to stay, a strategy that allowed them to bypass the natural defenses of their victims and gain entry to their most private, secure spaces. Once inside, Coleman's violent impulses would erupt with terrifying suddenness, as he would overpower his victims using blunt force weapons, strangulation, or sheer physical strength, while Deborah Brown, acting as his loyal enforcer, would assist in subduing the victims, participating in the sexual assaults, and helping to clean up the crime scenes before the duo calmly walked away and disappeared into the night. In July of 1984, after leaving a trail of blood and terror across Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, Coleman and Brown made their way to Kentucky, where they committed one of their most brazen and terrifying crimes, invading the home of an elderly couple in Dayton, Kentucky, beating them severely, and then driving their victim's car across the river into Cincinnati, Ohio, where they were finally recognized by a convenience store clerk who had seen their faces on a flyer distributed by the FBI. The recognition by the clerk sparked a massive police response that led to a high-speed chase through the streets of Cincinnati, ending with Coleman and Brown crashing their stolen vehicle and attempting to flee on foot before being tackled and apprehended by a coordinated swarm of local police officers and federal agents, a dramatic and violent conclusion to a 53-day reign of terror that had left at least 8 people dead and countless others physically and psychologically scarred for life. The subsequent investigation and prosecution of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown was a logistical nightmare, as the sheer volume of crimes committed across multiple states required a massive, multi-jurisdictional legal effort that had never before been attempted in the American judicial system, leading to a series of trials in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois that would take several years to complete. The trial of Alton Coleman in Ohio was the first to reach a conclusion, as he was convicted of the aggravated murder of Virginia Temple and her daughter Rena, and sentenced to death, a verdict that was entirely expected given the overwhelming forensic evidence, including fingerprints, DNA, and eyewitness testimony, that tied him to the brutal killings. In Indiana, Coleman was tried and convicted for the murder of Tamika Turk's grandmother, who had been beaten to death during the same attack that left the 7-year-old girl so severely injured, and he was again sentenced to death, adding another layer of finality to his inevitable execution. Deborah Brown, whose defense attorneys argued that she was essentially a hostage of Coleman's manipulative personality and suffered from a severe dependent personality disorder that rendered her incapable of resisting his commands, was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to die in Ohio, but her death sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole by the governor of Ohio, a controversial decision that sparked intense debate about the nature of female criminality and the concept of duress in serial murder cases. Alton Coleman, however, received no such clemency, and after exhausting all of his appeals across 3 states, he was executed by lethal injection on April 26, 2002, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, a highly anticipated and widely publicized event that brought a definitive, albeit deeply unsatisfying, end to a case that had haunted the Midwest for nearly 2 decades. The broader implications of the Alton Coleman case are profound and deeply unsettling, as it completely shattered the established psychological and geographical profiles of serial killers that had been developed by the FBI in the late 1970s, which assumed that serial predators operated in a fixed geographic zone and targeted a specific victim type, assumptions that Coleman and Brown's highly mobile, completely random spree rendered entirely obsolete. The case also exposed the devastating vulnerabilities inherent in a decentralized, state-by-state law enforcement system in the face of a highly mobile killer, highlighting the critical need for a centralized, federal clearinghouse for violent crime data that could track patterns across state lines, a need that eventually led to the expansion and modernization of the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. The impact on the families of the victims was absolutely devastating, as the sheer randomness and brutality of the crimes left them with a profound sense of injustice and a lingering, unresolved trauma that was only partially alleviated by Coleman's execution. A cold, clinical ending to a saga of human suffering that defied any rational explanation. The legacy of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of American criminal justice, a terrifying 53-day window in the summer of 1984 when two completely amoral human beings walked freely among the vulnerable, exploiting the inherent trust and goodness of ordinary people to satisfy a bottomless, insatiable appetite for violence, pain, and death, leaving behind a permanent scar on the collective psyche of the American Midwest that serves as a grim, enduring reminder that evil does not always have a fixed address, but can sometimes be the stranger knocking on your door, smiling softly, and asking for a glass of water. Number 9. Richard Chase, the profoundly psychotic and deeply terrifying serial killer known as the Vampire of Sacramento, who, in a mere month at the end of 1977 and the beginning of 1978, committed a series of horrific murders in California that shocked the nation with their sheer brutality, their bizarre ritualistic elements, and their complete lack of any rational, understandable motive. Born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara, California, Richard Trenton Chase grew up in a middle-class suburban household that appeared completely normal on the surface but which was secretly plagued by a deeply toxic and psychologically destructive family dynamic, characterized by an emotionally abusive, highly controlling father and a severely alcoholic mother who frequently engaged in bizarre, inappropriate behaviors in front of her children. As a teenager, Chase exhibited a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior that went far beyond typical adolescent rebellion, including a chronic, uncontrollable fascination with blood and death, severe hypochondria that led him to believe his internal organs were shrinking and that his heart was stopping, and a devastating addiction to alcohol and hard drugs that completely derailed his mental health and accelerated his descent into full-blown psychosis. In his early 20s, Chase's mental health deteriorated to the point where he was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility under California's Lanterman-Patrice Short Act, a law designed to protect the rights of the mentally ill but which, in Chase's case, resulted in his premature release back into the community after a brief period of observation, a catastrophic failure of the mental health system that directly enabled the murders that followed. During his time in the psychiatric facility, Chase's behavior was so bizarre and disturbing that he earned the nickname Dracula from the staff, as he was frequently caught capturing small birds and animals, killing them and drinking their blood, a practice that he justified to the bewildered staff by claiming that he needed to ingest the blood of living creatures to replace the blood that he believed was constantly draining from his own body due to his imaginary organ failure. Despite the obvious and extreme danger he posed to the public, Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and released to the custody of his mother in 1976, a decision made by a panel of psychiatrists who genuinely believed that his condition could be managed with outpatient medication, a horrifying miscalculation that completely failed to account for Chase's absolute refusal to take his prescribed antipsychotic medications and his rapidly escalating delusions. Once released, Chase's behavior became increasingly erratic and deeply disturbing. He began prowling the neighborhoods of Sacramento at all hours of the day and night, knocking on strangers' doors and asking to use their bathrooms, a highly suspicious behavior that was actually a cover for his true motive, which was to search the medicine cabinets of the homes for blood, organs, or any substance that he believed could replenish his own supposedly failing body. By late 1977, Chase's delusions had reached a point of absolute, unbreakable fixation, and he made the terrifying psychological leap from drinking animal blood to drinking human blood, a transition that was catalyzed by his deeply paranoid belief that his body was turning to dust, and that only the ingestion of fresh, warm human blood could reverse the process and save his life. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase committed his first murder, entering the home of 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin through an unlocked sliding glass door and shooting the unarmed man multiple times with a .22 caliber handgun as he was walking out to check on a noise in his yard, a seemingly random, motiveless killing that terrified the entire neighborhood and baffled the Sacramento Police Department. The murder of Ambrose Griffin was followed just days later, on January 11, 1978, by a horrific home invasion that would cement Chase's reputation as one of the most depraved killers in American history. Chase forced his way into the home of a pregnant 22-year-old woman named Teresa Wallen, shooting her 3 times as she carried a load of laundry into the kitchen. After shooting Wallen, Chase's behavior escalated into a nightmare of almost incomprehensible savagery. He dragged her body into the bedroom, sexually mutilated her with a butcher knife, removed several of her internal organs, and then filled a yogurt container with her blood, carrying it into the bathroom and drinking it, an act of necrophilic cannibalism that was driven not by sexual lust but by a psychotic, desperate need to cure his imaginary illnesses. The crime scene at Teresa Wallen's home was so horrific, so completely devoid of any recognizable human logic or motive, that veteran homicide detectives were physically sickened by what they saw, a level of visceral, primal horror that immediately signaled to investigators that they were dealing with an extremely disturbed, profoundly psychotic individual who was operating completely outside the boundaries of sane human behavior. Despite the massive, highly publicized manhunt that followed the Wallen murder, Chase remained completely undetected in the community, a ghostly, disheveled figure who wandered the streets of Sacramento in a state of complete psychotic detachment, preparing for his final, most devastating act of violence just 4 days later. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase committed the act that would forever define his legacy of evil. He walked into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth, who was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew David, along with her 6-year-old son Jason and a male friend named Daniel Meredith, and proceeded to systematically murder every single person in the house. Chase shot Daniel Meredith first, then entered the bedroom and shot Evelyn Miroth, before chasing 6-year-old Jason through the house and shooting him as he tried to hide in a closet, and then finally turning his attention to the toddler, David, whom he shot, killed, and then took into the bathroom, where he engaged in the same horrific acts of mutilation, organ removal, and blood drinking that he had performed on Teresa Wallen. After finishing his gruesome rituals, Chase calmly gathered the mutilated body of the toddler, placed it in the trunk of Meredith's stolen car, and drove back to his own apartment, where he further dismembered the child's remains and engaged in additional acts of necrophilia and cannibalism before finally dumping the body in a nearby ravine. The discovery of the Miroth home by a friend who came to check on Evelyn triggered an immediate and massive response from the Sacramento Police Department, and the sheer scale of the carnage, combined with the horrific, ritualistic nature of the crime scene, sent a wave of absolute, paralyzing panic through the entire city of Sacramento, a community that realized with horrifying clarity that a completely unpredictable, inhuman monster was living among them. The investigation, led by a highly experienced homicide detective named Richard Shelby, focused heavily on the bizarre, signature elements of the crimes, specifically the mutilation, the organ removal, and the blood drinking, which led Shelby to consult with FBI profilers who suggested that the killer was likely suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia and was driven by a delusional belief that he needed to consume human blood and organs to survive. The breakthrough in the case came from an entirely unexpected source when an acquaintance of Chase's, a woman who had previously witnessed him acting in a deeply disturbed manner and had been given a bloody shirt by him, contacted the police and provided them with his name and address, a tip that was immediately corroborated by a probation officer who recognized Chase's description from the media reports. When police arrived at Chase's apartment, they found a literal chamber of horrors. The walls were covered in blood, the refrigerator was stocked with organs and body parts wrapped in plastic, and a collection of blenders, mixing bowls, and yogurt containers sat on the counter, caked in dried blood, providing a horrifying, undeniable physical confirmation that they had finally caught the vampire of Sacramento. Richard Chase was arrested without incident, sitting calmly in his blood-soaked apartment, completely detached from the reality of his circumstances, a state of profound psychotic disassociation that would persist throughout his time in the criminal justice system and complicate every aspect of his legal proceedings. The trial of Richard Chase was a surreal and deeply disturbing spectacle, as the defendant's extreme mental illness was on full display for the jury to see. Chase arrived in court with bandages on his chin to prevent his imagined blood from dripping out. He frequently spoke to invisible entities, and he refused to bathe, leading to such a severe odor that the judge had to order the courtroom to be periodically aired out during the proceedings. The defense team argued vehemently that Chase was legally insane at the time of the murders, presenting a wealth of psychiatric testimony that detailed his lifelong history of severe mental illness, his profound delusions, and his complete inability to distinguish right from wrong, a legal standard for insanity that they argued was clearly met by the sheer absurdity and irrationality of his crimes. The prosecution, however, countered with their own psychiatric experts, who testified that while Chase was undoubtedly severely mentally ill, his actions demonstrated a level of premeditation and planning, such as bringing a weapon, seeking out unlocked doors, and hiding evidence, that proved he understood the criminality of his actions and therefore did not meet the legal threshold for insanity. In May of 1979, after a trial that deeply divided the psychiatric and legal communities, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Richard Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, a verdict that resulted in his sentencing to death by gas chamber, a punishment that the defendant received with his characteristic, terrifying blankness. The broader implications of the Richard Chase case are profound and deeply controversial, as it remains one of the most glaring examples of the catastrophic, fatal consequences of deinstitutionalization, the nationwide policy shift in the 1970s that resulted in the mass closure of state psychiatric hospitals and the release of thousands of severely mentally ill individuals into communities that were completely unequipped to provide them with the care and supervision they needed. The case forced a profound and painful reckoning within the mental health and legal professions regarding the fundamental inadequacy of the legal standards for insanity, which required a level of proof that was nearly impossible to achieve in cases of severe schizophrenia, where the perpetrator's delusions are so deeply embedded in their reality that they cannot distinguish their hallucinations from the physical world. Richard Chase spent the remaining years of his life on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where his mental health continued to deteriorate at a rapid pace, leading to increasingly bizarre and self-destructive behaviors, including a refusal to eat and a constant, paranoid belief that the prison guards were poisoning his food to prevent him from drinking blood. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell from an overdose of prescription antidepressants that he had been hoarding for months, a suicide that he had carefully planned and executed, a final, calculated act of agency that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, delusional frenzy of his crimes, bringing a quiet, definitive end to the life of one of the most disturbed and terrifying human beings to ever walk the streets of America. The legacy of the Vampire of Sacramento is a grim and enduring warning about the absolute necessity of a robust, well-funded mental health system that can identify, treat, and, when necessary, permanently contain individuals who are suffering from the most severe forms of psychotic illness, a lesson that has been learned and forgotten repeatedly throughout American history, always at the cost of innocent, vulnerable lives. Number 10. Coral Eugene Watts, the incredibly prolific and deeply enigmatic serial killer known as the Sunday Morning Slasher, who terrorized the cities of Houston, Texas, and Detroit, Michigan, throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, murdering dozens of vulnerable women with a level of speed, efficiency, and absolute stealth that allowed him to evade capture for over a decade despite being one of the most active killers in American history. Born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, Coral Watts grew up in a deeply dysfunctional, emotionally abusive household dominated by his father, a strict, authoritarian figure who frequently belittled and physically punished the young boy for the slightest infractions, a toxic environment that was further destabilized by the tragic and sudden death of Watts's mother when he was just 12 years old, a trauma that shattered whatever fragile emotional foundation he possessed and sent him spiraling into a dark, violent internal world from which he would never return. In his late teens and early 20s, Watts exhibited a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior that should have served as a massive, blaring warning sign to the mental health professionals who occasionally intersected with his life, including severe, uncontrollable bouts of rage, a complete inability to form normal emotional connections with other human beings, and a terrifying, hallucinatory fixation on the faces of young women, which he claimed would suddenly morph into the faces of demons. Bizarre, psychotic delusion that he used to justify his violent impulses. In 1974, Watts's violent tendencies escalated from disturbing fantasies into actual physical violence when he brutally stabbed 2 young women in separate incidents in Houston, attacks that he claimed were driven by the hallucinations he was experiencing, a defense that, while clearly indicative of severe mental illness, was completely unsuccessful in preventing him from being convicted and sentenced to a brief stint in a Texas psychiatric facility. Astonishingly, despite a documented history of violent, unprovoked attacks on women, the psychiatric facility determined that Watts was not a danger to society and released him after a very short period of observation, a catastrophic failure of the psychiatric and legal systems that directly enabled the subsequent murders of an estimated 80 to 100 women over the next decade. Watts's methodology as a serial killer was completely unique and fundamentally different from the vast majority of known serial predators, a deviation that made him incredibly difficult for investigators to track and profile. Unlike killers who had a specific victim type, a specific geographic comfort zone, or a specific method of killing, Watts operated with an almost machine-like randomness that defied all conventional criminological logic. He did not stalk his victims, he did not groom them, and he did not engage in any pre-crime ritualistic behavior. Instead, he would simply encounter a woman who happened to be in a vulnerable, isolated situation, such as walking alone at dawn, getting out of her car in a parking lot, or sleeping in her own bed, and he would attack her instantly without warning, using whatever weapon was immediately available. Watts's preferred weapons were knives, scissors, and blunt objects, which he used with devastating, surgical precision to inflict fatal wounds in a matter of seconds, a level of extreme, rapid violence that left his victims with absolutely no opportunity to scream, fight back, or call for help, a terrifyingly efficient killing style that earned him the grim distinction of being one of the fastest, most lethal serial killers in recorded history. Between 1974 and 1982, Watts moved fluidly between Houston, Texas, and Detroit, Michigan, two major American cities with large, diverse populations and vast, sprawling suburban landscapes that provided him with an almost unlimited supply of vulnerable, unsuspecting targets, a geographical mobility that was highly unusual for serial killers of the era, and which severely hindered the ability of local police departments to connect the dots between the mounting pile of bodies in their respective jurisdictions. In Houston, Watts frequently targeted young women who were walking or jogging alone in the early morning hours, earning him the moniker of the Sunday morning slasher due to his disturbing tendency to strike on weekend mornings when his victims were out exercising before the sun came up, a pattern of predation that created a climate of intense fear among the female population of the city and led to a massive, highly publicized police investigation that completely failed to identify him as a suspect. In Detroit, Watts shifted his hunting grounds to the city's affluent, suburban neighborhoods, where he would enter homes through unlocked doors or open windows in the middle of the night, silently creeping into bedrooms and stabbing sleeping women to death in their beds before slipping back out into the darkness without leaving a single fingerprint or any usable physical evidence behind, a level of stealth and precision that led some investigators to initially theorize that the killer was a ghost or a highly trained assassin. The sheer volume of Watts's killings is staggering. While he was only ever formally convicted of a small fraction of his crimes, investigators in both Texas and Michigan have attributed dozens of unsolved homicides from the late 1970s and early 1980s to him based on the highly specific signature nature of his wounds and his unique victimology, with conservative estimates placing his total victim count at around 80, a number that, if accurate, would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, surpassing even notorious names like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. The turning point in the hunt for the Sunday morning slasher finally arrived in May of 1982, when Watts broke into the Houston apartment of two young women and attempted to murder them, but a miraculous combination of the victim's desperate, fierce resistance and the unexpected arrival of a neighbor who heard the commotion and forced Watts to flee before he could complete his deadly mission. The two surviving victims provided police with a detailed and highly accurate description of their attacker, and a composite sketch was distributed to the media, generating a massive number of tips from the public that eventually led investigators to a name they had never previously considered: Coral Eugene Watts, a quiet, unassuming man who worked as a mechanic and who had absolutely no prior criminal record that would have placed him on the radar of homicide detectives. When police pulled Watts over for a minor traffic violation and brought him in for a lineup, both surviving women positively identified him as the man who had tried to kill them, providing the Houston Police Department with the probable cause they needed to obtain a search warrant for his home and vehicle. The search of Watts's residence yielded a deeply disturbing collection of evidence, including detailed, hand-drawn maps of the neighborhoods where multiple stabbing victims had been found, newspaper clippings detailing the murders he had committed, and a collection of weapons that matched the types of wounds inflicted on the victims, providing an irrefutable circumstantial case that he was the Sunday morning slasher. However, the prosecution of Coral Watts in Texas was immediately hampered by a massive, unforeseen legal obstacle. Because there were no surviving eyewitnesses to the actual murders and no physical evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, directly linking him to the crime scenes, prosecutors were forced to rely entirely on the testimony of the two surviving victims from the 1982 attack, which meant they could only charge him with aggravated assault with intent to murder, not with the dozens of homicides they knew he had committed. In a plea deal that remains one of the most controversial and heavily criticized in the history of American jurisprudence, Corral Watts pled guilty to the burglary and assault charges in exchange for a sentence of 60 years in prison, with the stipulation that he would be eligible for parole in just 20 years, a breathtakingly lenient outcome for a man who was suspected of murdering over 80 women. The rationale behind the plea deal was purely pragmatic, as the prosecutors knew that without direct evidence of the murders, a jury might acquit him entirely, allowing him to walk free, a risk they were unwilling to take. But the decision sparked absolute outrage among the families of the victims and the public, who were horrified that a prolific serial killer was going to spend less time in prison than many nonviolent drug offenders. For 2 decades, Watts sat in a Texas prison, a quiet, emotionless inmate who gave absolutely no indication of remorse or guilt for the lives he had taken, while the families of his victims in Texas and Michigan lived in a constant state of dread, knowing that the legal system had set a ticking clock that would eventually release the monster back into society. As Watts's parole date approached in the early 2000s, a dedicated coalition of investigators, prosecutors, and victims' rights advocates in Michigan launched a desperate, last-minute effort to ensure that he would never taste freedom again, utilizing a newly enacted Texas law that allowed prosecutors to use prior bad acts to establish a pattern of criminal behavior in order to keep dangerous offenders locked up. In a highly unusual and legally groundbreaking trial in 2004, Corral Watts was finally brought to justice for one of his Detroit murders, the 1979 stabbing death of Helen Dutcher, a case that had gone completely cold for 25 years until an eyewitness who had seen Watts fleeing the scene of the crime was finally located and convinced to testify. The jury in Michigan found Watts guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a verdict that effectively nullified the disastrous plea deal struck in Texas and guaranteed that the Sunday morning slasher would die behind bars. The broader implications of the Corral Watts case are deeply troubling and highlight the profound, systemic limitations of a criminal justice system that relies too heavily on physical evidence like DNA and fingerprints to secure murder convictions, a reliance that can allow highly intelligent, highly disciplined killers who leave no trace behind to literally get away with murder. The case also exposed the devastating consequences of prosecutorial pragmatism, as the plea deal that spared Watts the death penalty in Texas in exchange for a 60-year sentence was a short-sighted legal maneuver that completely failed to account for the sheer scale of his crimes and the overwhelming public interest in ensuring that a monster of his magnitude was permanently removed from society. Corral Watts died of prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, while serving his life sentence in a Michigan prison, a quiet medical death that stood in stark contrast to the violent, screaming, terrifying deaths he inflicted upon dozens of vulnerable women in the dark, lonely hours of Sunday mornings across the American South and Midwest. The legacy of Corral Eugene Watts is a grim and deeply unsettling reminder that the most dangerous predators in our midst are not always the loud, flamboyant, easily identifiable monsters portrayed in popular culture, but can sometimes be the quiet, unassuming, invisible men who walk among us, striking with the speed of a viper and vanishing into the night without a sound, leaving behind only a trail of broken bodies and a profound, enduring question of how many more lives could have been saved if the system had simply worked the way it was supposed to.